He took control of my agency and handed me a $500 severance. I didn't argue. I just smiled, slid a sealed folder across the table, and watched his smug face turn pale forever. "Get out of my company." Harrison snapped the words across the long, polished mahogany conference table, his voice echoing slightly in the glass-walled room. He didn't just say it. He delivered it like a judge handing down a final sentence to a criminal who had already lost the trial. He slammed his palm flat down right beside my cooling cup of coffee, and with his other hand, he slowly, deliberately slid a piece of paper across the smooth surface toward me. It was a check. I glanced down at it without moving my head. $500. He leaned back in his expensive leather chair, the one I had picked out and paid for 3 years ago, crossing his arms over his tailored suit. He looked at me with this sickeningly sweet, condescending smirk, the kind of smile you give a naive child who just doesn't understand how the real adult world works. He told me to take this generous severance package. He said my time here was done, and that he was graciously offering me this pocket change so I wouldn't leave completely empty-handed from the agency that he now considered entirely his own. He spoke about my agency like it had always belonged to his bloodline, like I was just some lucky, temporary girl who got to play pretend business owner until the real man showed up to take the wheel. Outside the glass walls of the conference room, I could see the silhouette of a security guard shifting his weight from foot to foot. Harrison had actually called security. He wanted the full theatrical experience of having me escorted out of the building with my belongings in a sad little cardboard box. I sat there, perfectly still. I am 38 years old, and if my career in building brands has taught me anything, it's how to read people. I didn't look at the check again. I looked at him. I looked at the slight dilation of his pupils, the arrogant tilt of his chin, the way his breathing was just a fraction too fast because he was riding the high of a power trip. He was expecting a reaction. He was desperate for me to cry, to scream, to throw the coffee in his face, to beg for my job back. He wanted a meltdown so he could point at me and say, "Look, I told you she was unstable." I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I didn't shed a single tear. I reached into my leather tote bag on the floor next to me, my movements slow and deliberate. I pulled out a thick, heavy black folder. It was sealed with a tamper-evident sticker across the opening. I placed it on the table, right on top of his insulting $500 check. I pressed my fingertips against the smooth cardboard cover and slid it back across the long table, right until it stopped an inch from his perfectly manicured hands. I smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a predator watching a mouse walk willingly into a trap. I looked him dead in the eye and said very quietly, "Open it slowly." But to understand how we got to this freezing cold moment in a high-rise office, to understand why his smug face was about 10 seconds away from turning permanently pale, you have to understand the foundation he tried to steal. Let me rewind the tape. Let me take you back to a time before the tailored suits and the glass conference rooms. Let me take you back to the dirt, the grind, and the sister I thought I would die for. 6 years ago, I didn't have a corner office. I had a vision board held up by cheap tape above a wobbly, second-hand desk I found at a thrift store. I started this branding agency with exactly one client, a laptop that overheated every 2 hours, and a terrifying amount of blind faith. People look at successful companies, and they only see the glossy finish. They don't see the years where your entire diet consists of instant ramen noodles and stale coffee because every single dollar you make goes straight back into keeping the business alive. I poured my entire late 20s and early 30s into that agency. I built it from my tiny, freezing apartment floor into a downtown loft with exposed brick walls and way too much sunlight. I remember the physical pain of exhaustion, the nights I would stare at the ceiling at 4 in the morning, my heart pounding with pure panic about making payroll, about paying vendors, about surviving just one more month. I traded my social life, my relationships, and my sleep to build something that was mine. And through all of that brutal grinding, there was only one person who kept me grounded. My younger sister, Abigail. Abigail is 4 years younger than me, 34 now. We lost our dad early, and our mom worked double shifts, so I basically grew up playing the role of the protector. I was the shield. Abigail was the golden child, the one who took the safe, conventional path. She went to college, got a solid degree, and landed a comfortable, stable job as a corporate human resources manager. She thought owning a business meant sitting in yoga pants all day answering a few emails. She didn't understand the relentless pressure of my world, but she loved me, and I loved her fiercely. I remember one specific Thanksgiving about 4 years ago. Abigail was stressed, her eyes red from crying. She confessed to me in the kitchen, while mashing potatoes, that her rent had been increased and she was 2 months behind. She was terrified of being evicted. I didn't even hesitate. I was struggling myself, eating into my meager savings, but I quietly transferred $2,000 into her account right there at the kitchen counter. I told her not to worry about it, that big sisters handle things. That was our dynamic. I absorbed the hits and I made sure she was safe. I would have given her a kidney if she asked. I trusted her implicitly, and I trusted anyone she brought into our lives. That was my first and almost fatal mistake. Because my fierce need to see my sister happy made me completely blind to the wolf she invited right to my front door. By year 3, the agency was no longer just a desperate dream. I had a solid roster of recurring clients, real brand equity, and serious traction in the industry. The ramen noodle days were finally behind me. I was breathing easier. And right around that time of upward momentum, Abigail met Harrison. She brought him over for a family dinner. On paper, Harrison was the absolute dream catch. He was 36, handsome in that very polished, corporate way, and he had a background in marketing and operations. He said all the right things. He complimented the food, he asked engaging questions, and he looked at Abigail like she was the center of his universe. She was glowing, happier than I had seen her in years. But I make my living understanding behavioral psychology. It is my job to analyze how people act, why they buy, and what drives their decisions. And my radar, my deep, instinctual gut feeling, was pinging like crazy from night one. It was the micro-expressions. I noticed how Harrison's eyes constantly darted around the room, always assessing, always looking for who held the most power. I noticed how he perfectly mirrored my body language to build artificial rapport. Most unsettling of all, I noticed how he subtly dominated the conversation. If Abigail started telling a story, he would gently touch her arm, smile warmly, and completely take over the narrative, finishing her sentences and making himself the hero of the anecdote. He was charming, yes, but it was a rehearsed, calculated charm. I didn't say anything to Abigail. How could I? She was planning a wedding, picking out floral arrangements, entirely consumed by love. I convinced myself I was just being an overprotective older sister, finding flaws where there were none. They got married. And shortly after the honeymoon, Harrison casually mentioned over coffee that he was feeling stagnant at his current corporate firm. He talked about how much he admired what I had built. He started offering little pieces of advice, analyzing my workflow, pointing out small operational inefficiencies. He was right about some of them. He offered to come on board as a consultant to help me scale the operations, handle the boring logistical stuff so I could focus purely on the creative and strategic side of the business. Abigail looked at me with those pleading, hopeful eyes. She thought it was a brilliant idea. 2 family members working together, building an empire. It sounded so perfect to her. Against every alarm bell ringing in my head, against every logical business instinct I possessed, I caved. I wanted to support my sister's new husband. I wanted to integrate him into the family. I handed him a company laptop, an access badge, and a generous salary. I essentially wheeled the Trojan horse right past my own gates, handed him the keys to the city, and went back to sleep. I had no idea that Harrison didn't want to help me run my company. He wanted to own it. And he was going to start by making me a ghost in my own house. You know the old saying about the boiled frog, right? If you drop a frog into boiling water, it jumps right out. But if you put it in lukewarm water and slowly turn up the heat, the frog will just sit there and let itself be cooked alive. That is exactly what Harrison did to me. He didn't come in making demands or throwing his weight around. He came in as the helper. In the first few months, he was incredible. He optimized our vendor contracts, he streamlined the invoicing process, and he took a massive amount of administrative burden off my shoulders. I was genuinely relieved. I thought I had found a true partner. But then, the water started getting warmer. It started with small things. An email thread with a client where I wasn't copied. A minor decision about office supplies made without my input. When I brought it up, he would hit me with that warm, disarming smile and say, "Oh, Caroline, I know how swamped you are with the creative side. I just wanted to take this tiny thing off your plate. You work too hard. Let me handle the small stuff." It sounded so caring. It sounded like support. Then came the bigger moves. He brought in a guy named Dalton to act as an external consultant for our digital growth. Dalton was Harrison's old fraternity brother, a guy with a slick resume and not a lot of actual substance. I didn't see the need for him, but Harrison pushed hard, claiming Dalton had the exact connections we needed to land bigger contracts. The real turning point, the moment I felt the water simmering, was during a major pitch meeting with a lucrative local client. I had spent 2 weeks developing a comprehensive brand strategy. It was my baby. We walked into the room, and as I opened my mouth to begin the presentation, Harrison stood up. He walked to the front of the room, turned on the projector, and proceeded to deliver my entire presentation. He used my words, my slides, my strategic concepts. He presented them flawlessly, with incredible charisma, completely acting as if he was the mastermind behind the entire campaign. I sat there, frozen in my chair, watching my own brother-in-law steal my intellectual property right in front of my face. When we got back to the office, I confronted him behind closed doors. I was furious, but he didn't apologize. Instead, he looked at me with deep, manufactured sympathy. "Caroline," he said, his voice soft, "we are a team." The client responds better to a male presence in the room when talking about numbers. It's just psychology. I was just acting as the delivery system for your brilliant ideas. We won the account, didn't we? A rising tide lifts all boats. He spun it so perfectly that I ended up feeling petty for even bringing it up. I swallowed my pride for the sake of the business. I let the water get hotter. If Harrison's professional manipulation was a slow burn, his personal manipulation was a masterclass in psychological warfare. In the behavioral psychology world, there is a term called triangulation. It's when a toxic person uses a third party to control the dynamic, creating a triangle of communication where they are the sole filter of information. Harrison began triangulating my relationship with my sister. Abigail used to drop by the office all the time. We would grab lunch, gossip, talk about life. Slowly, those visits stopped. When I called her, her responses were brief, distracted. I didn't understand what was happening until we had a family dinner at my mother's house. I was talking about a new project, explaining the creative direction, when Abigail suddenly sighed heavily and put her fork down. "Caroline," she said, using a tone she had never directed at me before, "you are micromanaging the team. You need to learn to let go. Harrison says you are becoming obsessive about the brand, and it's creating a toxic environment." I felt like all the air had been sucked out of the dining room. I stared at her. Micromanaging? Obsessive? Those weren't Abigail's words. Abigail didn't know the first thing about our daily office operations. Those were Harrison's corporate buzzwords, perfectly planted in her mind over weeks and months of private conversations. He had been coming home every night, playing the exhausted, hard-working husband, feeding her exaggerated stories about how difficult I was to work with. He was painting a picture of me as a frantic, control-freak boss who was holding the company back, while framing himself as the patient savior trying to keep things afloat. I tried to defend myself. I tried to explain what was actually happening. But Harrison reached out, gently grabbed Abigail's hand, and looked at me with this performative look of deep concern. "We're just worried about your health, Caroline," he said smoothly. "You're burning out. You look exhausted all the time. You need to step back before you have a breakdown." I watched my sister squeeze his hand back in agreement. She looked at him with such trust, and she looked at me with pity. That was the most agonizing moment of the entire ordeal. It wasn't the stolen ideas or the money. It was realizing that Harrison had successfully rewritten my sister's reality. He had severed the bond of trust that took a lifetime to build, and he had done it without raising his voice once. He had turned my own flesh and blood into a weapon against me. I was losing my company, and worse, I was losing my family. The isolation tactics escalated rapidly after that dinner. Harrison realized he had successfully neutralized Abigail, which meant he had a free pass to accelerate his takeover at the office. He stopped inviting me to key client meetings altogether. If a client asked for me, he would smoothly lie, saying I was out sick or taking a much-needed mental health day. He started aggressively cultivating loyalty among the staff, taking them out for expensive lunches on the company card, praising them publicly, and subtly undermining my authority. He created an environment where the staff felt they had to go through him to get anything approved. I was becoming an unwelcome guest in the house I had built brick by brick. Then came the morning of the lobby wall. I walked into the office on a Tuesday at 8 in the morning, holding my coffee, my mind occupied with a new marketing campaign. I stopped dead in my tracks in the reception area. The massive, backlit acrylic sign on the wall, the one that used to proudly display the name of the agency alongside my name as the founder, had been changed. My name was gone. It was just the generic agency title, modernized, sleek, and entirely devoid of my identity. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I marched into Harrison's office, my hands shaking with a mix of rage and disbelief. I demanded to know what he had done. He didn't even look up from his laptop. He took a sip of his sparkling water and calmly stated that we were rebranding. That removing my name made the agency look larger, more corporate, less like a boutique freelance operation. He said he had already run it by the senior team, and they all agreed. It was a blatant lie, but it didn't matter. The message was clear. I wasn't being overlooked. I was being actively, deliberately erased. The final nail in the coffin was a week later. Harrison called an all-hands meeting. He stood at the front of the room, looking grave and deeply sympathetic. He announced that due to the incredible stress of the industry, I was experiencing severe burnout. He used words like unstable, fragile, and compromised. He looked right at me, surrounded by my own employees, and told them that for the good of the company and for my own mental health, he and the newly formed management committee had voted to restructure the leadership. He was officially taking over as managing director. I was being sidelined to a vaguely defined advisory role, stripped of all financial and operational authority. I looked around the room. A few people looked down at their shoes. Others nodded in agreement, clearly having bought into the narrative he had spun. They thought they were helping a sick woman. They thought he was the hero stepping up to save the ship. I sat there in silence. I realized then that if I screamed, if I fought back right there, I would only prove his point. I would become the crazy, unstable woman he claimed I was. So, I did the hardest thing I have ever done in my life. I lowered my eyes, I nodded slowly, and I accepted the demotion. I let him think he had won. Because while he was busy turning me into a ghost, I was about to become a very dangerous kind of invisible. We encourage viewers to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with the name of the city they live in. Every comment helps the video reach a wider audience. Thank you very much. For the next few months, I played the part they assigned me. I walked through the office like a ghost, a shell of the woman who had built the company from the ground up. I spoke softly, I kept my head down, and I let Harrison bask in the glory of his newly acquired empire. The employees treated me with a mixture of pity and awkwardness, stepping out of my way in the hallways as if failure was a contagious disease. It was humiliating, yes. But it was also incredibly illuminating. Because when people think you are broken, they stop paying attention to you. And when they stop paying attention, they get sloppy. It was a Tuesday night, about 8 months ago. The office was completely empty. The cleaning crew had already come and gone, leaving the faint smell of lemon polish in the air. I had stayed behind, pretending I was too exhausted to drive home. In reality, I was waiting for the server room to be completely unmonitored. I walked over to Harrison's desk. He was so arrogant, so utterly convinced of his own invincibility, that he had stopped locking his main workstation. He assumed I was too technologically inept, or just too depressed, to go snooping. I sat in his plush chair, the leather still slightly warm, and woke up his monitor. I bypassed the basic security protocols I had originally set up years ago, protocols he never bothered to change, because he thought he was the smartest guy in the room. I started digging into the financial subfolders. I wasn't looking for anything specific at first, just an irregularity, a thread I could pull. It took me 3 hours of scrolling through endless digital spreadsheets, comparing invoiced amounts against our actual vendor deliverables. And then I found it. It was buried under a nested folder labeled Team Development and Culture. It was an invoice for $22,000, paid out in a single lump sum. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, my heart suddenly beating a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. The pay was a company called Apex Solutions LLC. I cross-referenced the vendor database. There was no contact name, no physical address, just a registered agent in a neighboring state and a routing number. I copied the routing information and ran a deep background search using a skip tracing tool I still had access to from an old marketing data contract. The name attached to the Shell account popped up on the screen in cold, hard text. Dalton. Harrison's old fraternity brother. The external consultant who had miraculously appeared to help us scale. I sat back in the chair, staring at the ceiling. $22,000. It wasn't just a misallocation of funds. It was blatant, documented embezzlement. He was funneling my company's revenue right into his best friend's pocket under the guise of corporate consulting. In that exact moment, something fundamental shifted inside my brain. The deep, agonizing grief I had been carrying for months, the sorrow over losing my sister, the pain of seeing my life's work hijacked, it just evaporated. It was replaced by a startling, crystalline clarity. I didn't feel the urge to cry. I didn't feel the urge to call Abigail and scream at her for marrying a thief. The victim narrative that Harrison had so carefully constructed for me shattered into a million pieces. I stood up in the silent, dark office. I washed my face in the restroom, looking at my reflection under the harsh fluorescent lights. The sadness was gone from my eyes. The prey had just realized she had teeth, and the hunt had officially begun. The hardest part of any strategy is patience. The temptation to walk into work the next morning, slam the printed invoice on Harrison's desk, and demand his immediate resignation was overwhelming. But I knew that if I confronted him with only one piece of evidence, he would spin it. He would claim it was a legitimate expense I just didn't understand, or he would blame Dalton, or he would simply use his majority influence to have the board sweep it under the rug. He had the staff, he had the narrative, and he had my sister. One invoice wasn't a kill shot. It was just a flesh wound. I needed a massacre. So, I implemented the most difficult psychological defense mechanism of my life. I decided to lean entirely into the madwoman narrative he had created. I played the fool. I started coming to work wearing baggy sweaters and minimal makeup. I sighed heavily during meetings. I let my sentences trail off as if I couldn't hold a train of thought. Whenever Harrison spoke, I offered no resistance. I agreed with his terrible operational changes. I nodded vacantly when he patronized me in front of the junior designers. I became the perfect, compliant, broken woman he needed me to be to fuel his narcissistic ego. And it worked brilliantly. Harrison became drunk on his own perceived brilliance. His guard didn't just drop, it completely vanished. He started conducting his shady phone calls with the office door cracked open. He left sensitive financial documents sitting on the edge of the printer. He felt so superior to me that he didn't even perceive me as a threat in the same room. While he was busy playing CEO, I was busy building an invisible army. The first call I made was to Fiona. Fiona is my old business mentor, a ruthless, brilliant corporate attorney who had helped me file my initial trademark paperwork 6 years ago. We met at a dimly lit diner on the outskirts of the city, far away from anyone who might recognize us. I slid a thick manila envelope across the sticky diner table. It contained the proof of the $22,000 transfer, along with a dozen other suspicious, smaller discrepancies I had found since that night. Fiona opened it, adjusted her reading glasses, and silently reviewed the documents while eating a plate of dry toast. When she finally looked up, her expression was completely unreadable. She took a sip of her black coffee and leaned forward. She didn't offer me sympathy. She offered me strategy. She looked right at me and said, "Caroline, never fight fire with fire. You don't scream, you don't argue, and you do not let him know you are onto him. You fight fire with paper. You drown him in it." Under Fiona's guidance, I hired a discreet private investigator specializing in forensic accounting. His job was to trace every single penny that had flowed out of the agency since the day Harrison was hired. We weren't just looking for Dalton's shell company anymore. We were looking for the entire underground network. We were mapping out the disease so we could cut it out perfectly. Every day at work, I would smile weakly at Harrison, make myself a cup of tea, and quietly document another piece of his impending destruction. Gathering evidence of financial fraud was only half the battle. Harrison still technically controlled the day-to-day operations and had effectively locked me out of my own bank accounts. If I just went to the police, the resulting legal battle would tie the agency up in litigation for years. The company would bleed clients, the reputation would be ruined, and I would be left with a hollow victory over a bankrupt shell. I didn't just want Harrison gone. I wanted my company back, intact and profitable. I needed a structural failsafe. I needed a poison pill. Working late nights from my kitchen table, Fiona and I began executing a brilliant, complex legal maneuver. In total secrecy, I formed a brand new legal entity called LNC Creative Holdings. We registered it as a quiet, standalone holding company. It had no public face, no website, and no employees. It was simply a vault. Then, the meticulous, exhausting work began. Over the course of 4 months, I started quietly shifting the foundational assets of the agency. I was still the legal founder and primary shareholder on paper, a fact Harrison had arrogantly overlooked in his rush to seize operational control. I used that leverage. Every new, major design concept our team produced, I secretly filed the primary copyright under LNC Creative Holdings, not the main agency. Every updated brand strategy, every proprietary workflow document, I watermarked them with an invisible digital signature tied directly to the new holding company. I was basically pulling the structural support beams out of Harrison's house and replacing them with my own, all while he was admiring the fresh paint on the walls. The crowning achievement of our strategy, the absolute masterpiece of Fiona's legal mind, was the intellectual property transfer. I reached out to a larger, highly respected partner firm across the country, a group of executives I had worked closely with for years and trusted implicitly. I explained the situation to their board in a closed-door, confidential meeting. They were appalled by Harrison's actions and agreed to help. I executed a secret, legally binding sale. I sold 60% of the agency's intellectual property rights, our core brand equity, and our proprietary digital assets to this partner firm. But here was the genius part. Fiona drafted a massive, ironclad whistleblower clause embedded deep within the 100-page transfer agreement. The clause stated that if any illegal activity, fraud, or financial misrepresentation was discovered under the current operational leadership of the agency, the partner firm's 60% ownership would immediately and irrevocably default back to the original founder who blew the whistle. Me. It was a legal bear trap. Harrison thought he was sitting on a multi-million-dollar gold mine. He had no idea that the mine was already empty, the gold had been moved, and the ground he was standing on was rigged to explode the second he made a wrong move. I had built an entirely new empire beneath the floorboards of the old one. Now, all I needed was the perfect moment to pull the lever and watch him fall. The final phase of my plan required Harrison to make a mistake so massive, so publicly undeniable, that he wouldn't just be fired. He would be utterly radioactive to the entire corporate world. I needed a stage, and he conveniently built one for me. About 2 months ago, Harrison started obsessively pursuing a massive contract with Virion Tech, a global technology conglomerate looking to launch a massive international expansion. It was the kind of multi-million-dollar account that makes or breaks an agency's decade. Harrison was desperate to land it. He wanted to prove to the industry and to his own inflated ego that he wasn't just managing my leftovers, but that he was a visionary rainmaker in his own right. He started working the Virion executives, taking them to expensive dinners, playing golf, selling them the moon and the stars. There was only one problem. Harrison was a fantastic salesman, but he possessed zero actual creative talent. He couldn't design a logo to save his life, let alone build a comprehensive, international brand strategy. He needed spectacular collateral to close the deal, and his junior designers were completely overwhelmed by the scale of the request. I saw my opening. I decided to give him exactly what he needed, laced with arsenic. I spent 3 weekends locked in my apartment, channeling every ounce of creative energy I had left. I developed a stunning, cutting-edge branding package tailored perfectly for Virion Tech's expansion goals. It was some of the best work of my career. But before I exported a single file, I embedded deep, encrypted copyright metadata into every single image, every vector graphic, and every presentation slide. The metadata explicitly named LNC Creative Holdings as the sole proprietor and included hidden tracking pixels. Then I casually left the entire folder on the agency's unprotected shared server, nestled in a directory I knew he constantly monitored. I didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, I logged into the server logs from my phone while drinking my morning coffee. I watched, highly amused, as Harrison's IP address accessed the folder. He didn't just view the files. He downloaded the entire package, scrubbed my initials off the file names, and hastily slapped his own management watermark on the cover slides. He was going to use my stolen, secretly copyrighted life's work to pitch the biggest client in our history, entirely convinced he was getting away with the perfect crime. The bait was taken. Now, I just needed him to confess to stealing it. Digital logs and forensic audits are incredibly powerful in a courtroom, but they lack a certain emotional punch. I needed something visceral. I needed proof of his malicious intent, something that showed he wasn't just careless, but actively, arrogantly predatory. I needed to hear him say it. The day before the final presentation to the Virion Tech executives, Harrison was practically vibrating with nervous energy. He was pacing around the office, snapping at the interns, adjusting his expensive tie every 5 minutes. I knew he was going to hold a final prep meeting in the small, soundproofed huddle room at the back of the office. Before anyone arrived, I slipped into the huddle room. I took a tiny, high-fidelity digital voice recorder I had purchased specifically for this occasion, wrapped it in a piece of black tape, and secured it underneath the center conference table, right near where Harrison always sat. I hit record and walked out, grabbing a stack of meaningless paperwork to look busy. 10 minutes later, Harrison called me into the room. He wanted me there, not to contribute, but to serve as a prop. He wanted to show the team that he had the founder tamed and sitting quietly in the corner while he drove the ship. I sat down, clutching my paperwork, projecting maximum anxiety and insecurity. I looked at him with wide, worried eyes and pitched my voice to sound perfectly timid. "Harrison," I said, hesitating appropriately. "Are you sure we have everything ready for Virion? I've been looking over the market data, and I'm just a little worried about the pitch." "Should I be worried? Do we have strong enough creative assets?" He let out a loud, condescending laugh. He leaned back in his chair, directly over the hidden microphone, and steepled his fingers. He looked at me with an expression of pure pity. "Caroline, please. Relax. Let the adults handle the heavy lifting today. You don't need to worry your head about the creative assets." "Nah, I looked through the archives. We just recycled a bunch of your old and used stuff and polished it up. They'll never know the difference. It's brilliant. Let me handle all the talking and the high-level strategy tomorrow. You just sit there, look supportive, and smile pretty for the clients. Understood?" I felt a cold thrill rush down my spine. It was perfect. The sheer arrogance, the casual admission of theft, the blatant sexism. It was all captured in crystal clear high definition. I lowered my eyes, forced a meek nod, and whispered, "Okay, Harrison. Whatever you think is best." I left the room an hour later, retrieved the recorder, and immediately uploaded the audio file to 3 separate secure cloud servers. The forensic audit was complete. The intellectual property was legally secured. The theft was documented, and the confession was on tape. The trap was fully armed, the safety was off, and Harrison was standing right on the trigger. Which brings us back to the present day. Back to the freezing cold, glass-walled conference room. Back to the moment he told me to get out of my company, slapped that insulting $500 severance check on the table, and waited for me to break. I had pushed the sealed black folder across the mahogany table. I had smiled that cold, predatory smile and told him to open it slowly. For a long moment, Harrison didn't move. He stared at the folder like it was a live, explosive device. His smug expression began to fracture, replaced by a sudden, creeping unease. He glanced around the room. There were 2 team leads, our chief accountant and a junior designer who looked like she was actively praying to become invisible. They were all watching him, the tension in the room so thick it was hard to breathe. Harrison had orchestrated this meeting as a public execution to assert his total dominance. He had ensured there was an audience. It was the worst mistake he could have made. With agonizing slowness, his perfectly manicured hands reached out. He broke the tamper-evident seal. He flipped open the heavy cardboard cover. It was like watching a man step off a cliff in slow motion. First, he saw the forensic audit. It wasn't just a spreadsheet. It was a 50-page document signed by a certified fraud examiner. It detailed the $22,000 transfer to Dalton's shell company, alongside dozens of other fabricated expenses, phantom vendors, and misappropriated funds. He saw screenshots of his own deleted internal emails, recovered by the investigators, explicitly discussing the embezzlement. His face drained of color. The healthy, confident flush vanished, leaving behind a sickening, pasty gray. He flipped the page, his hands beginning to shake violently. He saw the intellectual property transfer documents. He read the clause detailing the secret sale of 60% of the company to the partner firm. He read the whistleblower provision. His eyes darted wildly across the legal jargon, his brain struggling to comprehend that the empire he thought he ruled was actually owned by a holding company he had never heard of, controlled entirely by me. But the final page was the killing blow. He reached the end of the packet and froze completely. He let out a strange, choked sound, a cross between a gasp and a whimper. I don't understand, he stammered, his voice cracking, the smooth baritone completely gone. Oh, you do, I said quietly, the silence in the room amplifying my voice. Page 14 outlines the total forfeiture of your operational shares due to criminal liability. And page 15, well, page 15 is my favorite. He stared at the scanned signature on the document. It was my signature. Except it wasn't. I had a handwriting analyst review the past year of corporate filings, I explained, leaning forward, resting my elbows on the table. It turns out you have been forging my signature on banking authorizations for almost 11 months to bypass the dual approval protocol. The room went deathly still. The accountant covered her mouth with her hand. The intern stopped breathing. Harrison looked up at me. The arrogance was entirely gone. He looked small, terrified, and utterly ruined. He knew, and I knew, that embezzlement is a corporate dispute. But forging a signature on a federally insured bank transfer? That is wire fraud. That is a federal crime. He wasn't just morally bankrupt, he was legally utterly vulnerable. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my skirt. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. In about 20 minutes, I said, letting the words hang in the air, my attorney will serve you official notice. You are no longer with this company. You have 10 minutes to pack personal items under the supervision of the security guard you so kindly called for me. Do not touch a single company computer. Just then, the glass door opened. Abigail walked in. She had driven over for lunch, expecting to celebrate Harrison's big day. She stopped, looking at the folder, the terrified staff, and her husband's ash-white face. Harrison, she whispered, her voice trembling. What's going on? Harrison looked at his wife, the woman he had manipulated and used as a human shield for years. And in his final act of desperate cowardice, he pointed a shaking finger at me and whispered the only honest words he had ever spoken in that building. "She set me up." "No, Harrison," I said, looking right past him to my sister. "I didn't set you up. I just turned on the lights." The aftermath of that meeting was chaotic, but I didn't stay to watch the wreckage. I let security escort Harrison out of the building. I left the folder on the table for the accountant to read, picked up my bag, and walked out into the crisp spring air. It was April 5th, 2026. A date I had circled on my mental calendar for months. The date the economic narrative of Harrison's life would permanently collapse. I drove straight to my apartment. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't pour a drink. I walked to my kitchen counter, opened my laptop, and pulled up the draft email I had written weeks ago. The subject line was simple, urgent, regarding the pending Virion Tech partnership with Harrison Whitaker. It was addressed directly to the chief executive officer of Virion Tech, a man who famously hated corporate deception. I didn't write a long, emotional essay. Business people don't care about drama. They care about liability. I simply outlined that the creative assets Harrison had presented to them were stolen, strictly copyrighted materials belonging to LNC Creative Holdings. I stated that the current managing director was currently under federal investigation for wire fraud and embezzlement. I attached the forensic audit summary, the side-by-side comparison of my original timestamped design files versus Harrison's forged versions, and finally, the audio file from the huddle room where he laughed about recycling my old stuff and told me to smile pretty. I hovered my finger over the trackpad for exactly 3 seconds, feeling the weight of the last 6 years pressing down on me. Then I clicked send. The corporate reaction was swifter and more brutal than even I had anticipated. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, I received a direct reply from the CEO of Virion. It was brief and terrifyingly polite. It thanked me for protecting their firm from severe legal liability. Needless to say, it read, "The deal is permanently off. We will be launching an internal review of all communications with Mr. Whitaker." Harrison's house of cards didn't just fall, it incinerated. Virion Tech didn't just pull out of the deal, they blacklisted him. In the hyper-connected corporate world, word of a poisoned multi-million-dollar deal travels fast. Within 48 hours, 3 of our other major clients, having caught wind of the sudden leadership change and the rumors of fraud, announced they were freezing all ongoing projects pending a full internal review. Investors panicked. The bank froze the main operational accounts based on the forensic audit I provided. Harrison was entirely cut off from the funds he had planned to use for his legal defense. He was economically obliterated in the span of a single weekend. 3 days later, the reality of his situation finally crushed him. My phone buzzed on my nightstand at 3:27 in the morning. I didn't answer it. I lay in the dark and watched the screen as the voicemail transcribed live. "Caroline, please," his voice pleaded through the digital text, sounding hoarse, frantic, completely stripped of his usual polish. "You have got to stop this. You've made your point." Virion pulled out. "The investors are threatening to sue me personally. Abigail left me. I have nothing. I am begging you, call off the lawyers. I'll give you whatever you want." I deleted the voicemail without listening to the audio. It wasn't the sound of a powerful man making a deal. It was the sound of a parasite realizing the host had died and it had nowhere left to feed. He still didn't understand that I didn't want anything from him. I just wanted him gone. The next evening, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Abigail standing in the hallway. She looked terrible. Her clothes were wrinkled, her makeup was smudged, and she was shaking uncontrollably. She looked like a ghost of the confident human resources manager she used to be. I let her into the living room. She collapsed onto the sofa and immediately started sobbing. She told me everything. She said Harrison had come home in a blind rage, screaming about how I had ruined him. In his panic, the mask had slipped completely. He had admitted to the shell accounts, the stolen money, the forged signatures. He blamed her for not controlling her crazy sister. "Caroline, I didn't know," she wept, reaching out to grab my hand. I swear to God I didn't know about the money. I didn't know he was forging your name. You have to believe me. I am so sorry. I should have listened to you. I looked down at her hand covering mine. I felt a profound, aching sadness in my chest. I believed her. I knew she hadn't known about the financial crimes. She wasn't a criminal. But as I pulled my hand away gently, I realized that the financial crimes weren't the real betrayal. I let her speak. I let her apologize over and over again, but I didn't say the words she desperately needed to hear. I didn't say it's okay, because it wasn't. The tragedy wasn't just what Harrison did. The tragedy was how quickly, how easily, my own sister had believed his lies about my sanity. She had watched me build a life from nothing, she knew my heart, and yet she chose to believe a man she had known for 3 years when he called me crazy. She chose his comfort over my reality. I thought you would always bounce back, she whispered, her voice breaking, looking at my cold expression. You are so strong, Caroline. You always bounce back. I gave her a sad, soft smile. I walked over to the front door and opened it. No one should always have to bounce back, Abigail, I said quietly. She looked at me, realizing the absolute finality in my voice. The bridge wasn't just burned, the ashes had blown away. She stood up, wrapped her coat tightly around herself, and walked out without another word. I closed the door, locked it, and finally, after 8 months of silent warfare, I let myself cry. The legal system moves slowly, but it moves with crushing weight when it has paper proof. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in my new office. It was a space I had designed from the ground up, funded by the capital secured under LNC Creative Holdings. Floor-to-ceiling glass, sunlight pouring in, no exposed brick this time, just clean, sharp lines. My name was etched into the frosted glass on the door. Caroline Vance Consulting. No more shared decisions. No more Trojan horses. That morning, a courier delivered a heavy manila envelope with no return address. Inside was a single, formally drafted document from Harrison's newly appointed public defender. It was a signed letter officially relinquishing all operational and financial claims to the original agency and its assets. In exchange, he requested no further civil pursuit. The federal charges for wire fraud and embezzlement were already in motion. This was just his desperate attempt to stop me from taking whatever pennies he had left in civil court. I signed the agreement. It was over. Later that afternoon, my assistant knocked on the glass door. She smiled broadly and handed me a printed email. It was from the executive team at Virion Tech. They didn't just want to hire my new firm. They wanted to officially license our entire proprietary brand strategy for their global rollout. It was a contract worth triple the original pitch Harrison had ruined. During the final onboarding video call with Virion CEO, he paused before signing off. He leaned forward, looking through the camera, and asked with genuine curiosity, "Caroline, whatever happened to that guy you used to work with? The one who tried to sell us the stolen deck?" I looked out my window at the city skyline below. I thought about the voicemails, the panic, the absolute destruction of his ego. I smiled, a real, genuine smile this time. "He was just a temporary glitch in the system," I replied smoothly. "We patched the security flaw, and we moved on." They laughed. I didn't. Because to me, none of this was a game, and it certainly wasn't funny. This was survival. Revenge, I learned, doesn't feel like the climax of a blockbuster movie. There are no explosions, no cheering crowds. True revenge feels like clarity. It feels like silence. It feels like waking up in a house you own, knowing no one can ever change the locks on you again. Looking back at my new office, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. But sometimes, in the quiet moments, I think about Abigail's face when I closed the door on her. I protected my life's work, but I lost my only sister in the process. So, I have to ask you all, am I the villain here? Was I too cold, or should I have given my own flesh and blood a second chance? Thank you so much for listening to my story. If you found yourself nodding along, or if you have a different take, drop a comment below, I'll be reading them. And if you haven't already, Please hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on more crazy family dramas like this. See you in the next video.